Okay, welcome everybody. So the title of today's lecture is called The War of Egos, and it's based off of a Buddhist quote, or a quote directly from the Buddha, right? But I usually like to start off with like a preamble, because these thoughts come to me before the main thing. And the preamble is this, right? We are in the process of becoming. That's what the Vietnamese word for tu is, like just the process of becoming, right? And cultivation implies that you're cooking, right? Cooking takes time, right? You could stick things in a microwave, but that's not really cooking. That's A. And then B, it's almost like cooking, like being inside the shell of a cocoon, right? It's not instantaneous. That transformation takes time, okay? And when you're ready, because there will be a moment when you're ready, you never know when, but when you're ready, you'll be able to really shed behind whatever's holding you back, that once defined you, right? And when you think about it, butterflies don't fly around with their cocoon shells, right? They leave it behind. They become the next thing, right? And before, and I love this analogy, caterpillars are grounded, to leaves, grass, whatever they're feeding on, right? And so is a cocoon. They're attached to the branches, right? But a butterfly is truly free. It's truly liberated. It has wings, right? And so all of this talk, all of this education is really about that process. And it's a beautiful process, right? So we're just simply here to experience the metamorphosis, right? Metamorphosis can't be forced either. It just takes time, okay? And there's once upon a time, I was particularly lost about something, right? And so I had to Google it. I'm like, what to do when you're lost? Because most people in life, especially in the early 20s or wherever you are in life, sometimes we do get lost, right? We lose our way, so to speak, right? And so I came across this quote that said this. It says, if you're lost, seek education. And once you're educated, seek execution. As in, like, make an effort and try because you know better. And if you're executing and you're trying, seek consistency. And then if you are consistent, then you can seek results. Oftentimes, people who are lost want instant results. They don't go in between the in-between steps, right? But that's where the magic really happens, okay? And so just keep that in mind. Let that become like a mental checklist for you guys in life, wherever you are. That's it. All right, on to the main lecture, which is a quote directly from the Buddha. I find it to be very relevant, and I really like it. It's a paradox at first. It says, in the war of egos, the loser always wins. In a war of egos, the loser always wins. What does that imply? Like, let's dissect that, right? Because it seems like a paradox at first. Why is it that the loser is always winning, right? Well, when you think about it, let's just say a clash, an argument between two people, right? On the surface, whoever gets the last say, it looks like they're the winner, right? But when you think deeply about it, who is it that actually wins, right? It's the bigger person, the one who backs down, the one who is able to really let go and relinquish, right? And doesn't need to have the last say, right? That's the person who's actually the one who's winning, right? The loser always wins, okay? So I want to ground this in examples of my day-to-day life, right? To showcase this, and then you guys, to some extent, get to reflect on whenever you guys do have an argument, right? How this is applicable. So my first example was in my day-to-day world, right? Where, I witnessed something. I witnessed a teacher screaming at a kid, telling this kid, take off your headphones, right? But he did it in a very aggressive manner. And it was just not okay in the moment, right? So on the side, I pulled him over and I said, hey, tone it down a little bit. I gave him this feedback, like tone it down, right? And instead of taking feedback, he chose to react, right? He got really loud and aggressive with me. Like, how am I wrong? Like, this was the policy, I'm doing my job, blah, 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 right? Instead of like seeking to understand context and being calm, he chose to justify and to showcase how right he was, right? I created a name for these types of people, right? I call them reaction bullies. And I think to some extent, it's useful to name things because the more you name them, the more you're able to tame yourself because you know what you're dealing with, right? It's not nearly as ambiguous. And let's explore this dynamic. I don't know, I'm sure there's like a proper name, but I just created this, right? I couldn't think of anything better. A reaction bully. What are they? It's people who do something wrong and then they overreact to make them feel right and to reframe the situation as if they are the victim and the other person is the villain, right? These are reaction bullies, right? And it's interesting because implied in how they react, they can never be wrong, right? And they're always in the right, and they need to be seen as being in the right. That's the first part. And the second part is this. In proving that they are right? It kind of only solidifies how wrong they are, right? And it's very ironic to some extent. But you want to dig down into like, why do people become reaction bullies to begin with? Why do they take this small problem, they're getting addressed by it, and then they explode from it, right? To some extent, they do this because they want to A, get their way, and B, they don't want to be addressed again. They don't want to get that feedback again, right? And so that's why, especially if you tell somebody something like, hey, let's just say somebody who's, let's take a benign example, right? But if you're a reaction bully, you'll respond to it equally the same way. Let's just say you're bad with budget and you're overspending, right? This is pretty benign. And somebody tells you, hey, you're overspending. Like we don't have enough. You're not putting it into enough savings, right? Guess what a reaction bully would say? Like, oh, your point of view is wrong. I'm right. I'm justified in doing X, Y, and Z. Blah 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 blah. Right? And then if you know, or if they know that the next time, if I react this way, and then I'm scaring the person from addressing me, maybe they won't address me again, right? And so that's the idea behind like reaction bullies, like why they do what they do, right? And what type of outcome they seek to accomplish, okay? And so that's one example. I want to give a second example, and then I'm going to bring in a interesting quote from Spider-Man and Captain America and a Marvel thing, because I think it is particularly relevant, right? Here's the second example, right? In my work, there was a teacher, right? She had a skirt that was way too short, right? I mean, we're in the school, so she had a skirt that's way too short. So she got this feedback from a female teacher that said, like, or a female boss that said, hey, your skirt's way too short, right? Instead of taking the feedback and receiving the feedback, right? She started yelling. She started being a very like petulant child, stating, oh, you guys are picking on me. You're making me feel uncomfortable. And then she displays like unprofessional behavior and walks out the meeting, right? And when you think about it, let's ground it back to that quote that we just had. In a war of egos, the loser always wins, right? She didn't just receive the feedback. She had to be right. She had to say, nope, you guys are wrong. You're doing X, Y, and Z wrong, right? But in stamping home all these things, it's showcasing her body of work. It's showcasing that she's absolutely wrong in that case, right? And I find that to be very ironic. And so let me connect the Buddha's quote to the quote that I recently saw in a clip. Have you guys seen Civil War? Marvel? No? Yeah, Captain America versus Iron Man? No? Anyway, it's just like a, Marvel cartoony thing. But there was a scene where Spider-Man was fighting against Captain America, okay? And he's obviously fighting, and then so Spider-Man is on Iron Man's team. And they're having a conversation while they're fighting between Spider-Man and Captain America. And Captain America asked him, okay, what did Iron Man tell you about me? And he said something so profound, I thought, oh my gosh, it's so applicable to today's day and age. He said, Iron Man told me that you're wrong, but you believe that you're right. And that's what makes you dangerous. And I was like, wow. You're wrong, but when you believe that you're in the right, you'll do everything in your power to make sure and to prove that you're right, even though you're wrong. And that's extremely dangerous. Now think about this as the source of conflict for so many people and parties around disagreements about anything and everything, right? Pick any conflict. Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, anything. Not to say that there's a definitive right and wrong, right? Because obviously a lot of these issues have nuance, but it's the people on the extreme who don't want to come to the middle to talk about the nuance that just ultimately believe, hey, I am 100% right, the other side is 100% wrong, nothing they can say can change my mind. That becomes extremely dangerous. That's the type of thing that creates radicalism, right? And so, to some extent, this talk and that quote wants me to transition to the two levels of ignorance, right? Because ultimately, when you think about it, these people are truly suffering. They don't know it because they're unaware, but they are truly, truly and deeply suffering, right? And so I wrote that there's two levels of ignorance, okay? And oftentimes people are prisoners of their own ignorance. The first level is the person who's attached to the concept of being right and wrong to begin with, right? These are the people who become reaction bullies. They're so invested in being right, in being perceived as right, that they have an outlandish reaction to any form of correction, any form of invitation to moderation, right? So that's something fascinating to think about. Then the second type of person is the person who is attached to the ego and to the perception of optics, okay? This is deeper. The second level is much deeper. Let's just say, right, that you guys are not the type of people who overreact to things. If you're wrong, right? And you'll fix it, sure. But that doesn't mean you're done with not being a prisoner of your own ignorance, right? You get to the next level where all of a sudden, you're not attached to being right or wrong, but you're attached to other people's perceptions of you, okay? And then all of a sudden, other people's opinions of you matter so much more deeply that you're willing to do wrong or incorrect things just to prove this to be true, okay? Here's this example of my day-to-day life, right? So I'm talking to an upset parent because she's not getting something. And she says, oh, I feel like I'm getting the runaround from the school because I'm getting one answer from one teacher and one staff member and another answer from this staff member and another answer from this, right? So I realized we're all on different pages, right? So I send out an email saying, hey, this parent's upset, right? She's getting a runaround. Let's all get on the same page about how to solve for this solution, right? One of the staff members felt very offended by this email because she felt like it was a direct attack on her. When really the intent, I guess that was the impact of the email. But the intent of it is, we're just trying to solve problems here. We're trying to, make sure that we get on the same page and address this lady, right? But this lady calls me up and is like extremely upset. It's like, why? It feels like you're throwing me under the bus. But I'm like, whoa. No one's throwing you underneath the bus. You're actually we don't even care about that. In fact, no one cares about it. And she's like, but I care. And then she proceeds to trash me on a lengthy social media post. And I'm like, whoa, okay. But in a war between egos, the loser always wins. Now, I could take all this and be extremely upset and reactive, right? Or I could be like calm about it and say, wait a minute. First off, this is no big deal. I don't actually have to respond back, right? I understand what's going on, but I'm also seeing that this person is still a prisoner of her own ignorance. This person still values, to some extent, right, is still attached to the perception of ego, right? It's still attached to the opinion of other people. So much so that she's willing to talk bad about somebody else just to prove that she's right. So now if you step back, you got to ask yourself, okay, who's right and who's wrong here, right? So for all these examples, of all these day-to-day examples, right? The people who refuse to let go of being either right or wrong, right? They are still stuck in a state of suffering, okay? And this is what the Buddha speaks about, right? When he talks about there's relative truth and there's absolute truth, right? On the surface, the person who gets the last word looks correct. But deep down, that person is absolutely, may or may not be right, but it's usually the one who's like trying to overreact or trying to prove a point, right? When they're not necessarily correct, that are still deep in their suffering, like deep. And so the idea is specifically a challenge to you guys. If you guys are in an argument, ask yourself, how do you receive the message, right? Do you guys seek to understand first before being understood? Or is it the case for you guys, right? And this is just a general message that you don't want to listen. All you want to do is react. Because on that level, you're still stuck. And you got to learn to let go, right? The idea is, at that level, you have to let go of being right or wrong and just listen. And then on the next level, you got to let go of just the opinions of others and look deeply, scour for the intent, right? And then if there is error, seek to educate, not alienate. This is huge. If the person that you're arguing with is indeed wrong, right? You don't accomplish what you want to accomplish by alienating them, by calling them names, by framing them as a villain. You educate them. You're calm about it. And you show them, hey, here's how things could have been better, right? That's the idea behind it. That's where the compassion piece comes in, right? And I always thought, how do we teach people how to let go? Because this is literally the whole premise of Buddhism. You guys want freedom from suffering? You have to learn to let go. But the question is, how? What's the practice looking like, right? And I realized, well, a couple of things. The people who are reaction police, right? They always take a small problem and they make it big. And then no problems at all become small problems. So perhaps the key is A, awareness, and B, reverse engineering things. And saying, hey, if it's a big problem, how could we make it feel like simply a small problem? And if it's a small problem, how can we make it feel like it's no problem at all? Right? That's the process. How do we take something that is enormous, that feels enormous in scope in your mind, and just be like, oh, that's nothing at all. Just do X, Y, and Z, right? Because the real people in life who actually do real work, they don't have time for drama. They don't have time for ego. They're about the work, right? It's literally about the work. Or, I mean, I'm simplifying, right? Who knows how many different types of conflicts there are. What did I write here? Once upon a time, we had to rate people on trustworthiness, okay? How do you know if you can trust somebody? Well, what I realized in the moment that I had to rate people, especially when there were random people in the room, was that it's very hard to do so. Especially after a moment's notice. Why is that? Because A, we could lie at any given moment, right? And B, you gotta ask, where does trust come from? Trust comes from a person's overall body of work. It's not just a singular time that you can trust somebody. It's over a series of moments and time that you can begin to say, okay, I see what you've done. Now I trust you, right? Where am I going with this? That's a good question. Why did I like to take detours, and then sometimes I forget why I took the detour. I have it in my notes, right? Yeah, so trust comes from when you observe a person's body of work. Darn, I wish I was able to make that connection clear. But yes, the idea becomes, and let me, I guess, take it back to this piece, which is, in order to avoid suffering, learn to let go, learn to become aware. And when you become aware, you're able to make a lot of your big problems smaller and smaller problems into nothing. And this is where the idea of trust comes in, right? Trust comes from your body of work. And all these things that we talk about takes time, okay? Again, if lost, seek education. If educated, seek execution. If you're executing, seek consistency. And if you are consistent, seek results. This singular lecture doesn't mean that, like, you don't necessarily apply in real life, right? You gotta apply this often, over and over again, with every single conflict that you come across, and then you begin to see the world in this way, okay? Let me say this one more time. And this is the last time I'm gonna mention this Buddha quote, right? Well, not the last time, but. In the war of egos, the loser always wins, okay? And I want you guys to think about this. When you guys get feedback, right? The loser is the one who reflects and sits with the feedback, and then they experience growth. Especially if somebody's wiser and they see deeper and further than you, then your job is really to sit there and listen. Obviously, you don't win the argument and you don't win in the moment, right? However, should you argue back, sure, you're the winner. But you stay stagnant, right? And you continue to wallow in that falsehood. And I'll tell you another example. My boss, right? My boss told me something recently. It was very minor. This lady was asking, hey, can we make a survey to send out to kids about XYZ things, right? And my boss says, why is she asking you to do it? Why don't you make her do it? For me, I'm very good with these things, right? It'll take me less than 5 minutes to create the survey, send it out to kids, blah, blah, blah. And so my boss gave me that feedback. And I wanted to reply to my boss and tell her, no, I can do it. It's only 5 minutes of my time. But I actually did not reply back to her. I sat there for 2 days thinking to myself, why is she telling me this? And really, it was part of my growth trajectory because I do a little bit too much, right? Part of my thing is like I take on other people's responsibilities. So I actually sat there and I reflected and I said, okay, I think you're right. I'm pretty sure you're right. Let me train this lady on how to create the survey so that she'll never ask me again, so that she's not taking up my time and I'm not doing her work, right? But I would have never arrived at that conclusion if I replied back to my boss saying, nah, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. It's only 5 minutes, right? Notice, in that scenario, I would have been right? But I would have lost anyway. So keep that in mind, right? In the war of egos, the loser always wins, provided you are reflecting and growing, okay? All right, so that's it for my lecture for today. Thank you.